Hi, everybody. John Haldy here, and I am super excited to have Tim Crawford with me. Tim, welcome.
Hey, thanks, John. Happy to be here.
For those of you who don't know, Tim is the CEO and founder, correct?
One of the co-founders, yeah.
One of the co-founders of TenStreet, and I know everybody watching this knows TenStreet. Tim, incredibly gracious of you to join us. Thank you.
No, absolutely my pleasure. Really appreciate it. Looking forward to it.
You and I met a couple months ago in Mississippi at a different meeting, and I had the pleasure of watching you give a presentation about the current state of the market and talking about best practices for recruiting and hiring and retention and all that good stuff. And I ran up to you afterwards and got on bended knee and said, is there any chance you would do that again for my audience? And you were really kind and said yes. And then the holidays came up. So we're finally getting a chance to do this right after the new year. So a million thanks in advance for being part of this. Any particular place you'd like to start, or would you like me to throw a few questions at you?
Why don't we start with your questions and let's see where we go.
So the one that's been on my mind lately, having just wrapped up 2022, at least to me, from what I heard from folks that I work with, this is a really tough market for finding and retaining drivers. I mean, it was drivers naming their own price for a while there, right?
Exactly.
What are you seeing? Because you got your finger on the pulse of a whole big part of the job market. What are you seeing these days? Has it loosened up at all?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it really depends on if you think about it being a picture, like where you set the zoom level, right? Do you look at 22 as a whole? Do you look at the fourth quarter? Do you look at the last couple of weeks of the year? If you look at 22 overall, if you said, hey, were drivers hard to find in 22? I think the answer to that is absolutely yes. Right? I mean, you average that out. If you say, hey, how did the end of the year compare to the beginning of the year? I think drivers were harder to find earlier in the year, in the first half, first quarter. Okay. Much harder than second half and much harder than the fourth quarter. Absolutely. And so, and you know, that layers, there's a couple layers there, right? You've got a seasonality layer, right? Is the typical ebb and flow of the freight market, typical ebb and flow of, you know, the holidays.
So I'm a dummy. Hold on a minute. The ebb and flow, I know there's peak season during the holidays. Are there other seasonal waves that I'm ignorant of?
Yeah, no, I think you've got the big one. I think the other part of it is there's the peak season around, hey, freight volumes, right? Depending on what segment you're in, right? Pickup and deliveries late, you know, over the road is earlier, you know, early in the fall. But I think the other ebb and flow that you see is in the driver market. Driver job applications, even though they were getting looser as 22 went on, about November 1st through the end of the year, they really tail off, right? They really tail off. And you think about it from the driver's perspective, it makes really good sense. If you want to maximize your chances of being home for the holidays, you don't want to be the newest person hired, right? So the drivers, if they have the ability to not look for the next job, not to move, and drivers are, I think, always more hesitant to move than sometimes carriers think. They're going to hit delay until about now, until the first part of January, right? And then you saw that decline happening, you know, the last couple of months, 6 weeks, the last 8 weeks of the year. And layered on top of, hey, drivers were a little bit more available than they were in the first of the year. And then you see the decline and you're like, okay, is the decline typical seasonality? Is the decline related to maybe some changes in the freight market? You know, what is actually going on? And I think, like most things, it's going to be the most obvious in retrospect, right? I mean, we've seen some signs that it's going to be a little bit of a muted busy season. Normally, we would see applications volumes go up between 20 to 25% on a per business day basis in January, you know, relative to December. I don't think it's a guess, right? At this point, you know, a couple of days into the year, I don't think we're going to see that in January. I don't know. if you think about when the freight market has contracted or stayed flat in the past, and you think about the driver market writ large, there tends to be two distinct stages, right? Early on, when the freight first starts to weaken and the collective consensus, if that's a meaningful, a good, decent way of putting it, is that drivers think, oh, I'm not getting the miles I want at carrier X, but there are miles out there. I'm going to move to carrier Y. And so you'll see application volumes tick up. Right? Then you'll see, and we saw some of that in October, November, where the weakening that we would typically see towards the end of the year wasn't as pronounced as it often is. Then what happens if the market stays flat, volumes decline, fuel stays high, right? Whatever the bad news that you want to pick out of the press, then you'll see applications really drop, where collectively what's happening is drivers say, hey, nobody has any miles. I'm better off staying where I am to preserve my spot in the seniority, right? To preserve the miles I do have. And so when we start to see applications really drop, it's like enough drivers are talking to enough recruiters, and the collective assumption is, no, there's just no miles out there. You're better off staying where you are. Are we in the first part of that in late 22? Maybe. I mean, there were some indications that maybe there were, but time will tell. Time will tell. I don't know if that makes kind of sense.
It does. I'm wondering though, in hearing you speak, the thought popped to my mind that you have this sort of macro market view because of where TenStreet is in the space. Do you have any insights into different pockets of the market, like the FedEx market, which is very heavily slanted towards like e-commerce shopping, right? Versus, reefers or tankers or those kinds of things. OTR, which, as you mentioned in the fall, would be loading up inventory for retailers and those kinds of things and getting them distributed around the country. Do you see any trends coming that could impact the audience who watches these videos?
Yeah, the unfortunate answer there is probably not anything terribly insightful. I mean, It's the obvious things of, hey, look, the numbers around, hey, is there weakness in construction? Is that going to affect the flatbed side? The reefer market, from what we can tell, seems to be relatively flat, relatively, stable.
Everybody's still eating.
Everybody's still eating. The drop in freight in relative terms, as we got out of the pandemic and as the spending patterns sort of reverted to the historic norm and people were spending more of their income on services and less on goods, that kind of shift had been underway. And so the question is, hey, is that shift going to continue as the economy slows down so that there's even fewer sort of goods out there? Is that going to impact the e-commerce exposed segments of the market more? Intuitively, I'd probably say yes. Do we have great data that we can point to and go, yeah, we can absolutely see it here? Because the lens that we tend to look at things through is, from the driver's perspective. Hey, how many drivers, where are drivers looking? Where are activity? And drivers are less sensitive, it seems, to the particular markets that they serve, and more sensitive to type of route, type of freight, right? Is it flatbed? Is it van? Am I going to be home on a regular basis, right? Is it over the road or more regular route stuff? So that's a long way of saying a really good question. Well, I wish I had better data.
Sure, me too. Speaking of data, as a novice in the recruiting space, because I've never done it, I did notice that the squeals of pain coming from contractors who couldn't find drivers seem to be highly correlated to the spot freight market. The Freight Waves has this sonar index of spot rates, and it seemed to track very well. And I'm guessing that spot rates, as it was reaching these new highs, that was pulling drivers from the entire market who were going after good fishing while it was available, right?
Oh, exactly. Yeah, I don't know if you saw the number of new DOT registrations was just astronomical, right? As people were like hanging out their own shingle, and that drove recruiting to be much more difficult. It pulled a lot of drivers into that market, and the drivers that stayed in that market absolutely drove their checks higher, right? Saw some crazy sign-on bonuses, really, really aggressive pay increases. And I think it'll be interesting to see, because those things tend to be much stickier upwards. Like the fuel guys is going to bounce around. Pay tends to stick where it, wherever the highest ebb was. So,
but if you look now, the spot market's cratered.
Exactly.
And, if you believe, like I do, that one of the reasons used truck prices were going through the roof was because everybody who could drive a truck was buying a truck and getting out there in the spot market and doing it on their own. I think it's causing, for 2023, I would guesstimate that the average cost of drivers has got to come in some. The availability of drivers at the current price is certainly going to get better, right? The supply the curve is going to change, but probably has an impact on truck prices too.
I think so. And I think you had this other factor around all the supply chain challenges. I don't think any of the clients I talked to in 22 were able to buy all the new trucks they wanted.
No, nobody was.
And so so that helped. If you look back, and I've been around the industry more years than I care to think about. If you look back over the last couple of these cycles, when the times were good, man, everybody bought as many trucks as they could get their hands on. You had this huge glut of capacity, and then when the music stopped, it was really a bloodbath. And what might make for a little bit of a softer landing this time is you didn't get this big surge in new trucks, right? It was the supply chain, helped to enforce some more measured growth around fleet sizes, right? And so that might make for a little bit easier adjustment as things come back into equilibrium over the next couple of quarters. At least fingers crossed.
So you're saying the party didn't get out of hand because they ran out of booze?
Yeah, that's it. That's a great way of putting it, but that's exactly what it feels like. So,
okay, so you would go along with the general premise that even though there's a bit of a freight pullback that's going to impact my customer base, if you will, the job market seems to be moving more, the pendulum swinging back towards their direction. It won't be as painful in 2023.
I think that's right. I think if the absolute level of hiring feels like it's going to be lower, right, than it was sort of the closeout 22, but I think drivers are going to become, relatively speaking, more available than they were in 22. And so I think for the segments or the carriers that have demand, I think they're going to be able to have better looks at drivers than they have been in the recent past.
So against that sort of macro backdrop, I can't think of anybody more qualified than you to talk about what works and what doesn't work in recruiting. Where would you like to start? Things they should be thinking about, or things they should not be doing because they don't work?
Yeah, I think it's. Let me make a couple of comments about what we see a typical driver job searching behavior.
Okay.
Because I think a lot of it, I think there's some misconceptions. I mean, and the first is, when we talk to a lot of carriers, they talk about, drivers, always looking to be in the market, right? And that, and what we see is the average driver's in the market twice a year in some form or fashion. right? And there's a really, really broad distribution there. There's some drivers who are looking, talking to potential employers every week, some once every 5 years. Average, we see drivers a couple times a year. The second thing is that what drivers tend to do is, and this is totally rational from their perspective, right? From a driver's perspective, every time they change employers, it costs them money. Every time, right? Because you think about it, they're at minimum going to lose, a week and a half's worth of pay, right? By the time you leave from one company, you go through orientation, and you say, hey, that's call it a 4% ding to your employment, to your comp, right? You're not going to take that lightly.
Sure.
Sure. So drivers, and what that means is that when they're in the market twice, they're going to look for a meaningful enough improvement to sort of offset, hey, not only am I have the potential for a better job, pay, home time, what have you, but also it's the quantum of improvement is enough that's going to offset the friction, if you will, of switching, right? So what that means is that they're in the market twice a year. The average driver, if you think about going through the hiring process, starting with typically like some sort of a lead application, name, rank, and serial number, and then if they're interested in the carrier and the carriers reciprocates that, they're going to do a full application, right? All the DOT required stuff, and then they're going to kind of move and get hired on. If you think all the way through the process, about half the time they never get past step one. They start and they talk to a couple of carriers, and they don't end up doing a full application for anybody.
Why?
Because they didn't find, in my view, they didn't find anything that made it compelling enough to sort of give up a week or two's worth of pay.
Okay.
Or, hey, I found out that even at first blush, the grass wasn't greener on the other side.
Okay.
And I did my due diligence. Hey, this is where I'm at is a good place.
So that's about half the time, you say, based on your data.
Yeah.
Because I know a lot of contractors worry that their recruiting efforts suck. And what I'm hearing is it's possible it had nothing to do with them. It was just people sniffing to see if the grass was greener, and it was kind of the same. So they just lost interest.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
That's exactly right.
Good insight.
And when they go out, right, if they got to that first step in the process, on average, they're going to talk to 2 carriers. So in the market, talk to 2 carriers. But the interesting thing is if they go forward at all in the process, I go to fill out a full DOT application. I'm consenting to background checks, all those things. The number goes from 2 carriers to most months, it goes from 2 to 4.
Okay.
2.5, right? Which again, if you're the driver, hey, I'm thinking seriously about it. I really think the grass might be greener on the other side of the fence. I'm going to talk to a bunch more carriers, right? So from the carrier's perspective, from the employer's perspective, if you think traditionally from a sales perspective, as you move a prospective client deeper into like the buying funnel, typically the deeper you move somebody in the funnel, in most places, the level of competition goes down.
But it just went like this, right? Because
exactly, it actually goes the other way. The other way. The deeper somebody gets into the process, the more competition you're talking to.
Because if he's going to go through this process, he's not narrowing it down at this point. He's broadening his or her view.
Exactly.
Cast a bigger net.
Exactly.
Okay. Fascinating.
And so what, the vigilance is the name of the game, right? Trying to move that process through. The other sort of thing that we see overwhelmingly, and this is probably obvious, but sometimes it surprises folks. I want to call it out. Almost the entirety of this job search process is mediated through their phone.
Okay.
85% of the applications we get, full apps, 85% of every part of the process we do, from first application through onboarding, comes across a small device. And so what that means from a carrier perspective is, hey, if you're doing marketing materials and it's got a great picture of the truck or what have you, as a carrier, you absolutely have to put yourself in the driver's shoes around, hey, go through your whole process, consume all those touch points on your phone, not on Wi-Fi, right? Go out to, the slow Wi-Fi you get at the coffee shop, right? Or just be on your cell connection. Because I can't tell you how many clients we have that have these beautiful pictures of equipment that take, 90 seconds to download onto a phone because it's such a high quality picture. Well, drivers won't wait for that.
Well, hold on. I got to make a pause here for the audience. Please pay attention to what Tim's talking about and let me connect a dot for you. As you know, the FedEx implementation of First Advantage doesn't let you take advantage of the mobile ready application. As Tim just said, everybody's doing this process on their phone. Since you can't put someone on their phone and have First Advantage work, please come up with an intermediary step, whether that's TenStreet, shameless plug, yes, or a Google form or something. Insulate your applicant from having to get off their phone and go to a computer to fill out the First Advantage information as much as you can by giving them a mobile ready option. And even if your people then have to type everything into First Advantage, it saves you from losing a lot of potential clients. Sorry for that. I had to and FedEx, if you're listening, please pay attention to how silly this whole process sounds. Please fix that. It's in your power.
And especially what adds insult to injury, right? At the time you're taking somebody through those tail ends of the process is actually where we see the highest level of competition, right? So it's not only is it mobile, it's absolutely the point in time when their drivers are talking to the most number of carriers. On average, we look at it monthly, most of the time they're talking to between 4.5 and 5 carriers at a time if they're really serious in the process. But it all happens mobile. Put yourself in your driver's shoes. And if you
and speed of response is critical in that, right? Somebody's
Absolutely.
going through applications with 5 companies. Are they going to wait for all 5 of them to go to a final decision, or are they going to jump when they get the offer they want?
They're gonna wait to a certain extent, but it is hard to overstate. If you want to get your company at the top of the list very consistently, speed absolutely matters. And let me detail that a little bit. We look at this data quarterly, you said on average, what we see is about 3% of drivers that start the process get hired from an individual carrier, right? And that varies a lot from carrier to carrier in terms of how they're sourcing, how many leads they're sourcing, et cetera. So don't get hung up if it's 3% is higher or lower than what you see. The drivers that got responded to from their carrier within 5 minutes of submitting an application, that 3% number typically goes to somewhere between 5 and 5.5%.
Almost.
So it is a massive increase. And if you think about the recruitment advertising dollars you had to spend to get those people to your site in the first place, the improvement in ROI from 3% to 5.5% over the course of a month, over the course of a quarter, it's a massive increase, right? Having the ability to respond quickly is so important. The difference in responding in 5 minutes to 30, within 5 minutes to within 30 minutes, that typically shows, between a 60% improvement over the baseline to about a, 35 to 40% improvement over the baseline. It is, minutes absolutely matter. That driver, if you think about it from the driver's perspective, I mean, the interesting thing about this market is that drivers do this with regularity. They know exactly what the process is, and they know and they have a degree of impatience with carriers who inflict bad processes on the driver. Right. And so making it really easy for the driver absolutely pays off. And that easy turns into speed. Right. You know, and the interesting thing is that 5 minutes, the only time that 5 minutes is less important is for the ballpark half the applications that come in after hours and on weekends. Right. Speed is still important if it's after hours and weekends, but the grading scale, if you will, gets a little bit more forgiving.
Okay.
Because if somebody applies on Saturday morning at 8 and all the other carriers reply Monday morning at 9, but one carrier replies Saturday at noon, right? That 4-hour response time is still, you know, orders of magnitude faster than a lot of carriers in the market. And my horrible line is it's kind of like being the valedictorian at reform school, right? If you can just respond within a couple hours on weekends, you're going to be, you know, leaps and bounds ahead of where other folks are. You know, and I think it's something that when we, anecdotally, most recruiting happens Monday to Friday, 8 to 5, right? And it's a very low base that happens off hours, even though a big chunk of the applications happen off hours. We're seeing more and more people trying to grasp that nettle. Hey, how do I go and do that? It's hard, and it's hard operationally to do it. You know, we're spending a lot of time on how do you make the recruiting side of the process work off of a small phone, right? Which is harder than the driver-facing side. But all focused on, hey, how can you give people the ability to respond quickly, regardless of the day of the week, regardless of the time of day. So that's minutes matter. Minutes are sort of critical.
And would you agree that leveraging technology to do some automated responses and get the dialogue going is a good thing, or do people see right through it? Oh, that's a bot.
As a technology guy, I'm a bit of a curmudgeon on this, in that then there's a degree of faddishness that happens. There's some novelty with some of the automated responses, and I think I think in 3 months and 6 months that's going to look like the pet rock fad in the market. Drivers are over the years see through relatively quickly of, hey, this is an automated email, or you'll see some people really focus on like artificial intelligence chat bots where they're trying to engage drivers, and it's hackneyed and horrible.
But I do like the honest ones that say, hey, we're all asleep right now, but you're important to us. Here's our link to our calendar. We want to talk to you first thing in the morning. Pick your spot.
Exactly. I think the cases where we see that are most effective, that transparency and honesty with drivers, treating drivers like a person, not like a product, win hands down, right? I'll even give you a more mundane example. Like if you think about the automated emails or just emails or messages in general, we've had clients spend lots of time and money creating a really beautiful looking email, graphic colors, fine-tuned wordsmithing. And they just get ignored en masse because it looks like every other email coming from retailers, coming from the emails that are very clearly that look like something that you would send to another person have far and away the best response, right? Because it's a personal decision for a driver typically to go join a carrier. And starting that on a personal relationship and as personal as you can be, right? In a high speed recruiting process absolutely pays off. Absolutely. Uh, so I mentioned minutes matter. The other thing we see is that days matter, right? If you think about the process that drivers have to go through, you mentioned the FedEx First Advantage kind of process to do all the employment verifications and get background checks back and all these things.
Good segue from minutes to days. Good one.
Yeah. And everybody's got a process that takes, days. And I think on average, our typical client sees a hiring cycle of circa 10 days from first application to hire. Is what we see as the average. But the 10 to 12 days, but in what we see routinely and regularly is the more clients can move their overall hiring process from 10 days to 8 or from 12 days to 7, the percentage of hires, their hiring rate goes up. It just does. And part of this is, again, I come at it again from a driver, understanding the driver's perspective. If you think back to that driver competition or the carrier competition side, hey, if I'm deep into your process, I'm day 6, day 7 of your process, I'm probably talking to 3 or 4 other carriers. All 4 or 5 of those carriers probably have asked me for 4 or 5 pieces of that of information supplemental to my application. Copies of CDL, I need a signed authorization. Oh, wait, one of the carriers you work for is out of business. Can I get a 1099 to substitute for a W-2? Whatever, for whatever, right? There's 1099 to substitute for the verification, rather. If you think about that from the driver's perspective, those 20 to-dos are scattered all across this driver's life, right? He's got some in text message. He's got some in voicemail. He's got some in email. He had some that he just talked to the recruiter live, and I guess he's writing them down on a piece of paper, right? I mean, it's scattered all across. The carriers that have the most success make it really easy for that driver, right? Give that driver here an electronic, small phone optimize. Here's the to-do list. Here's what the carrier's working on. Here's what the driver's working on. Hey, you get steps 1, 2, and 3 done, we're going to be good. Right. And you don't have this, we're going to make it really clear for you how to move through the process. The clients who do that most effectively are successful at compressing their overall hiring cycle. Because if you think about it, everybody likes to complain about employment verifications. And I used pre-TenStreet, that was my world. But they're only, 5 or 6 days, right? What's taken the rest of that time, right? If you think about an overall 10, 12-day hiring cycle, well, big chunk of it is the carrier waiting on the driver. Well, so the carrier's interest and the driver's interest align completely. Hey, let's make this simpler and get that paperwork out of the way really, really quickly. And so it's just a matter of, hey, how can you assemble the process and the technology, basically, so that things don't have to be that painful, right? How do you make it really clear to the driver? And it just works every time. Compress the hiring cycle, your hiring rate goes up. I mean, it's almost a law of nature.
If I can take you off this thread just a little, I've been listening and making the assumption that you're talking about your sort of traditional world where you're talking about someone who has gone looking for a job, which is sort of the Indeed model, the Craigslist model. The presumption here is that someone's out looking for a job. Someone I spoke to recently was explaining that Facebook's model is a very different model, which is they're not necessarily going to find someone who's looking for a job right now. They're going to put your ad for a job in front of people who are looking at things related to trucking, maybe. And hopefully maybe go, I've seen this ad 4 times now and a job. I hadn't even thought of a job, but maybe I should look. Does that change the dynamic? Does that change the numbers when it's an ad or a person who comes at it from a different thing that I'm going to go to Indeed and apply to 5 places?
I don't know that it does a lot, because that person, what we see is that person who looks at that Facebook ad. And I think there's absolutely merit to the idea of passive job seeking and, hey, how do you get in that person's selection set? That absolutely is a thing. But the lion's share of the time, what happens is after they put in that Facebook ad, or they respond to that Facebook ad, hey, I'm thinking about working for company X, they're going to go Google truck driving jobs. And they're going to say, hey, I'm in mode. Hey, if I'm the least bit serious, I'm going to go develop.
And then that muscle memory kicks in from their last search and they do the same thing.
Exactly. And so what we see happen though is, and there's not as much as on sort of the automated messages, but I think there is a degree, there's an ebb and flow in the market of which ad sources work, right? Be it Facebook or Craigslist or Indeed. And what we see is, we think it's really difficult to reliably predict what sources are going to work for what types of jobs, right? We see, and part of that is we see given clients, and if they take their recruitment advertising spend and they focus it on one place, they have less success than people who take the same budget and spread it out. It's essentially, if you think about walking up to the craps table and saying, okay, I'm going to put it all on one, I don't know if craps make a good analogy. I'm going to put it all in 43 red on the roulette table versus I'm going to go, take that same budget and spread it out across multiple bets. The diversification absolutely works. Same budgets, more diverse. You're going to happen onto, as a carrier, more of the sources that are working right then. Because, and all these things, they ebb and flow in terms of how those individual sites are attracting traffic. It's going to ebb and flow as the individual drivers are changing their job seeking behavior. A few years ago, Craigslist was fantastic, right? Could do no wrong. That was the place, right? And people navigated all the, the idiosyncrasies of working on Craigslist. And then it didn't. It worked really well until it didn't. Right? It was that because Craigslist changed their sourcing? Maybe. Was it because driver? Maybe it's all the above. It's a both and sort of situation. And so real far afield, I apologize, from your Facebook point. I think there's absolutely a component of that, identifying and nurturing those passive job seekers and getting in their selection set. There's absolute value there. Our perspective on that, though, is there are no silver bullets. You just got to fire a lot of lead ones, like to kind of maximize the chances of success.
Makes sense. Let me flip it if I could. You were talking earlier about what drives drivers to seek this grass is greener sort of first look. This goes in a way to retention, because if you move past the recruitment effort and you think I've got this driver, let's allow for the fact that once or twice a year, we're going to expect this driver is going to go sniffing and say, is the grass greener, right? Do you have any either data or intuitive sense on what percentage of those drivers are doing that because of just the natural desire to see what's out there, the pull, the attraction to look around, versus how much of that is caused by a work environment that's pushing them to want to look for change?
Right. Yeah. That's a great question. And it's clearly it's a mix of both. Absolutely a mix of both. And part of it is, driving is just, it's a tough job, and some things that are going to push you are just inherent to the job and nothing that, that a carrier can control.
But there's a lot of things a carrier can control, and I don't think
Exactly.
they're doing a good job there.
One of the things that we see, so we work with a lot of clients on driver retention, and through some surveys and trying to identify both systemic, hey, what are the areas that are the biggest sources of frustration for drivers, right? Onboarding, expectation setting during recruiting, payroll, maintenance, right? What are the big things? How does that vary by different terminals, different driver types, those sorts of things? But the one thing that's common is we try to look systemically, but I also try to look at for individual drivers, essentially like what I would call like a break glass scenario. Hey, John Doe is really unhappy, and his survey responses have gotten progressively weaker, right? Or he said that there's one in particular issue that's really bothering him. And in our terminology, TenStreet speak, we consider that's triggers what we call an intervention, right? A request for a specific person at carrier to reach out and talk through that specific issue with the driver. Just working the intervention, regardless of if it's resolved ultimately the way the driver asked for initially, but just working the intervention translates on average to something like 60 additional days of tenure right across the fleet. Picking up the phone, having a conversation, a human conversation about, hey, what's going on? Hey, this is what I can work out. How is this affecting you as a driver? What can I do not do? Not every phone call is going to result in a happy driver, but engaging with drivers on an individual basis, on a human professional basis of, hey, look, you're a professional driver, you're trying to do the right thing. Here's the constraints we're working as a carrier with our clients in mind. Just having that conversation translates to lower turnover rate. And I think too many times, I think carriers say, well, look, drivers unhappy about traffic in the Northeast, or, haven't put change on the truck going over through Colorado in the winter. There's nothing I can do about it. He's just gonna be unhappy. And our response on that is, no. I mean, the best answer is, hey, trying to engage that driver like, look, it snows in the winter, right? That's just, but we're gonna, here's what we can do. Here's how we're gonna make sure that how to put the chains on, or how to have trips scheduled appropriately to take into account traffic or what have you. Translates into happier drivers and longer tenure, right? And so big believers in how do you engage those individuals on a case-by-case basis, because that's absolutely where the rubber meets the road. It's horrible.
What number are you throwing out there when people ask you what's the average cost of replacing a driver? Do you have a ballpark that you like to toss out there, or a range?
Yeah, I mean, we look at it in a couple of different categories, right? Because some of them are directly variable, and some of them are only variable in the longer term, right? So if you think about the thing that's directly variable, it's going to be recruitment advertising, right? If you have fewer drivers to recruit next month, it's really easy to turn your recruitment advertising down. And that on a per hire basis is somewhere between $1,000 and $1,500 per driver on the recruitment side. That's easier to turn up or down. If you can do the things to more structurally pull your turnover rate down, now all of a sudden you can go, oh, hey, look, I'm spending less money on orientation, right? I'm spending less money on travel and meals and boarding during orientation, right? Hey, I have that truck on the fence for fewer days. It's out earning revenue, not sitting there incurring insurance and interest charges while I don't have a driver, right? Those things tend to be softer. And that's where you start to see, if you start to add up all those kind of costs that in the short run are all relatively fixed, you get numbers between $5,000 to $8,000 per turnover event. But those tend to be longer term. So we always like to caveat those. Hey, look, what's the line? Short enough run, all costs are fixed, and the long enough run, all costs are variable, right? And so we try to draw the line somewhere that's relatively short run of what can happen with better retention.
But I get the sense from what you're saying that there's a necessity to think about this as a numbers game.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
But at the same time, to recognize that every single driver is an individual and you can't treat them like a number.
That is the paradox. That's exactly it.
Okay.
And that's tough. Think about it from a recruiter's perspective. I was talking about, hey, you can move your hiring rate from 3% to 5%. And if you think about the 3 to 5, it's 60%, 70% improvement. That's fantastic. But if you think about it day in, day out from a recruiter, that's being told, no, not right now, 95 versus 97 times out of 100. Viscerally, that feels like much the same thing. Right. And so the challenge from a recruiting perspective is how do you treat those drivers appropriately, but do it, consistently. And that's the real challenge. And that's why it's hard.
Tim, we're starting to push up against the time that we had allotted, and I'm so into what you're talking about. I'm worried that I've missed some obvious questions that I should have asked you while I had the chance. What did I forget to ask that I should have?
I mean, I think you've done a great job. I mean, I think we've covered what the driver behavior is. We covered what the market may or may not look like in over the next couple of months, and we talked about what the big things that carriers do. I mean, I think the thing that I would probably circle back to is, on probably two things. One, on a routine basis, put yourself soundly in your driver's shoes, right? What does the process look like? What are the touch points? What does that experience look like? And how easy are you making it for drivers? Thought one. And then thought two, I would say, hey, look through your process from a compliance perspective. Compliance in this area is really, really tough. It just is. It's difficult. The costs of getting it wrong are really high, whether that's a nuclear verdict in the case of some kind of an accident. But it also can be high in terms of not complying fully with the employment laws. There's a lot of plaintiffs' attorneys out there just looking to sue somebody for a technical non-compliance around the laws that govern what you can do and how you can do it. Right. And there's more state-specific rules you have to follow, and it's complicated, and entropy can kind of set in, and so take a few minutes and look at things from a compliance perspective as well.
Someone who's been on videos with me before, similar name, Steve Crawford, said to me recently, I overheard him say to someone, you really should look in the mirror and ask yourself honestly, would you work for you if you were a driver? And to hear you put it also, would you finish the application process if you had to go through what you set up? Great insight there. Because the truth is, for the FedEx folks, they are an outsourced staffing agency and fleet manager. And if they can't recruit and retain, then half their mandate they suck at.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's a really good way of putting it. Yep.
So they better get good at it, or they should change their field, their chosen field.
Yeah.
Tim, we're going to put in post-production your contact info. I'll put what you choose to put. I know your time is very valuable, but I cannot thank you enough for taking time out of your day to share your insight and wisdom with the folks watching. Thank you so much.
No, you are so welcome. I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed it. It was a lot of fun.
And I hope you'll consider coming back and talking with us again.
I'd be more than happy to. Absolutely.
Awesome. Tim Crawford, CEO and co-founder of TenStreet. Folks, if you have thoughts for what we could talk to Tim about when he comes back, please send them to us, put them in the comments. We always watch those. Thanks so much, Tim. We'll talk to you soon.
Sounds good. Take care.